Well, the question that's been on my mind over the past couple of weeks has been, how do we embrace things, fully embrace things that we know we will one day lose? A couple of events have made me ask this question more and more, and the first was something that happened a few weeks ago when I wasn't preaching here in the pulpit, but was preaching at my college, Austin College in Sherman. And I was preaching there on a Sunday morning in the chapel, and like it was here that Sunday morning, we were honoring the Day of All Souls, setting aside time to remember those in our lives who had passed and died. And there was a part of the service near the middle in which we engaged in the ritual of reading aloud the names of people printed in the order of service who had attended the college, who had died in the previous year, along with the year they graduated. And two events from that morning really stuck out to me. The first was that while we were reading the list of names, we called out the name of a person who had graduated from the college in the late 1930s. And we were asked each time a name was called if we knew that person to stand. And one person stood as that name was called, an elderly man in the back pew, the only person to stand, knowing his friend who graduated college with him in the 1930s, this man holding himself up on the back of a pew for just a moment to visibly honor the life of his friend. And then a few moments later, we got to the name of one of my friends who had died in January. My friends and I, who were in the sanctuary that day, stood for that brief moment when our friend Jeff's name was called. And then I sat back down on the chancel like this and looked over at the choir that Sunday, which had been seated behind me to my right, and it was a choir of around 50 college students. I looked over at the faces of this young choir who had been providing music for us that Sunday, and many of them looked tired from the night before. Many of them, they had the college letters on their choir robes. And as I looked into the faces of those choir members singing, it made me think of the face of my own friend who just months before I had seen as his body lay in a casket, immaculately dressed in his military uniform. I remembered that during those days when we knew each other in college, I had no indication that we would be reading off his name at that service in so few years. And I looked at that choir of students singing behind me and wondered if we would be calling out any of their names in too few years. It was this kind of concrete, all too concrete reminder that this is not going to last forever. I wondered why it sometimes takes me such severe reminders to wake up to that fact. Those experiences made me immediately think back to those words from Jane Kenyon's poem that we read this morning, Otherwise. It's one of my favorite poems. Here, this woman, Jane Kenyon, responds to the events of a single day. She says, I got out of bed on two strong legs. It might have been otherwise. I ate cereal with sweet milk and a ripe, flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. That refrain throughout the poem over and over again, it might have been otherwise, and then she ends with the words, but one day I know it will be otherwise. Now I know this is not a sermon for All Souls, but rather Thanksgiving, just a few days away now. But I read in her words this kind of necessary connection between gratitude and impermanence, knowing deep in our bones that this will not last forever. And I hear her practicing this beautiful art of recognizing the preciousness of ordinary things, naming the preciousness of ordinary, fleeting things. So she gives us the setting of her home on a farm, and it's got elements of privilege in it, to be sure. She's talking about silver candlesticks and paintings on the walls, right? But the things she mentions in the poem, the moments and things she lifts up, are simple, concrete, ordinary things. She talks about getting out of bed, having daily meals, laying down with a loving partner, taking a dog for a walk, and sleeping in a safe room. Now, her words are beautiful and profound to me on their own, but there is some context to these words that I think makes them all the more profound to me. So Jane Kenyon wrote this poem in 1993 while she was living on the family farm of her husband, the poet Donald Hall. And Donald Hall was a number of years her senior. He had just been diagnosed with cancer and was not expected to live long. So Jane Kenyon in 1993 wrote this poem knowing that, but not knowing that after the poem was published, she would be diagnosed with leukemia and die only a few months after that, leaving the world before her husband. So when I read this poem, it makes me wonder how real those words must have been for her. How much in that in-between period she must have known in her bones the preciousness of ordinary things that will not last forever. Hear those words again. I ate cereal, sweet milk, ripe, flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. At noon, I lay down with my mate. It might have been otherwise. I slept in a bed in a room with paintings on the walls and planned another day just like this day. But one day I know it will be otherwise. So I see in Kenyon's words that she decided to take a spiritual response to impermanence. And her spiritual response was to name it out loud, to take pen to paper and articulate the words, this precious, unique, fleeting moment in my life did not have to be and will not be forever. The precious, unique, fleeting moments in my life could have been and will be otherwise. And this title for today's sermon is lifted entirely from the title of Anne Lamott's new book, Help, Thanks, Wow. And in her book, she says that these are the 3 essential prayers. Now, I would add a few to her list and call them prayers or not in your life. I think what she's talking about are basic ways that we decide to respond to being alive. Sometimes we meet life and all we can do is stay silent in its mystery, which is beyond all naming. Wow. Sometimes we have a moment of radical acceptance for what is, and the only appropriate response is thank you. But I think you know as well as I do that often we meet life where it is, and our response is no. No. Sometimes we respond no when we feel like we are not enough. No. And sometimes we respond no when the world is not enough, or we see the imperfections of others and we want them changed. And I think that there is an appropriate time for all of these different kind of responses in our lives, a time for righteous anger, a time for criticism of the world and its injustice and imperfection, and a time for generous gratitude and genuine awe. But I know how easy it is for me to fall into the habit of saying no before I've said anything else. And I think we have to set aside these national semi-sacred days so that we can practice a different way of being together and responding to life. We don't set aside a holiday so that we can practice the desire for more and more and more. We don't have to set aside a national holiday where we get to practice seeing other people's faults magnified bigger than our own. Some responses come easier to us than others. But in Thanksgiving, and I think we overlook this because of the busyness and the travel and how kind of saccharine we can make these holidays, I think we forget that this is about practicing a different response to being alive. On Thanksgiving, we don't get to choose whether or not life and our lives are fleeting. That is not our choice. But we do get to decide how we will respond to that reality. And I think this is what spiritual life and spiritual disciplines are all about, deciding which response to life are you going to practice cultivating? How are you going to practice another response to being alive? You know, whether it's physics or cosmology or ancient sacred texts, this call to gratitude reminds us that every person in this room, every moment that has ever been, is a unique, unrepeatable expression of the universe itself. I think that is what the writers of the early Christian writings were pointing toward when they said that their God cared as much for every single sparrow and every lily of the field. But staying awake to this fact of otherwise is not easy. In writing this, I imagined that the Zen monk Thich Nhat Hanh, if he were here in our service today, would rise from his seat and come up to the pulpit and greet me in his brown monk's robes and his shaved, bald head and his smiling face that doesn't show its 86 years. And I imagined Thich Nhat Hanh asking me to engage in the practice that he asks people to engage in on many of the retreats he leads. People in those retreats are asked to stand and look into the eyes of the person in front of them and say the words, "One day I will die. One day you will die. These moments are all we have." A difficult practice. A difficult practice indeed. But I don't think that this practice of saying yes to what is has to look like a retreat or standing in front of someone you know or don't and saying the words, "I'm going to die, so are you." I think this practice can come to us as easily over dining room tables and gatherings of friends if we let it. And the practice is this: naming the preciousness of ordinary things that will not last forever. My wife Kate and I have a group of close friends here in Dallas that we've known for many years, and once a month we all get together, 11 or 12 of us, and we meet in someone's home for dinner and to spend time together. And it's always at somebody else's house, and we've kind of adopted some rituals there. I don't remember when this ritual started, but early on in our practice of meeting and having dinner in each other's homes, we adopted the ritual after dinner of standing, raising a glass to toast the evening, and every person stands and says to the group one thing that they're grateful for that night. And it seems really simple, but this practice did not come easily to a lot of people at first. It can be really awkward to give public expressions of gratitude and grace. We're not used to it. But I have to tell you, these are some of my best friends on the planet Earth, and there are things I now know about them that I don't think I ever would have known if we didn't stop and ritualize saying thank you out loud. There are parts of their souls that I have never seen before these moments of gratitude and struggle, because those are, I think, connected. So I've watched people stand up and give thanks for children or talk about their difficulties in trying to have them. And I've watched as my friends stood to give thanks for meaningful work and cry about the attempt to find meaningful work. And just like in Jane Kenyon's poem, the things that people name are concrete, ordinary, fleeting gifts. Most often, what people say they're grateful for is people. A lot of times, it's actually just the people sitting around the table, and I can't tell you how many times the thing someone has been grateful for is the opportunity to say something they are grateful for. How grateful they are that we've ritualized something that not many of us ritualize in our lives. This is the time in the sermon when I put in a plug for church. Huh? This is one of the only places where we gather as hundreds of people and still do that. This is one of the only places where we gather, and it's really unique in its ability to give thanks for precious things that will not last. Church is this unique animal. It's something that is here for you, but is not only here for you. It's a place that's full of compromise, and I think the reason why it's best at helping us give thanks for fleeting moments is that there's just so much life in here. We bless babies, and we perform marriages and commitment ceremonies and memorial services all in the same room. And if you commit to this place and being a member of this church, and you stick around long enough, we are going to bless each other's children, and we are going to attend each other's memorial services. Not abstract people, this group of people. What an odd and beautiful thing we do. And that might have been otherwise. So easy to focus on the mundane imperfections that keep getting in the way of my holy moment I had planned. I imagine you have these moments around the dining room table with family and friends at Thanksgiving, all these people getting in the way of Thanksgiving. You know, there's something that I mention every time I perform a wedding or a memorial service that I think we should probably say more often out loud in church, and that is this fact. Because of the nature of church with visitors and guests and old friends, this exact group of human beings, this group, will never be together again. This is the only hour when this group of human beings will ever be in the same room together. This moment is unrepeatable in the history of all that has ever been. So this year at Thanksgiving, as you're with family or friends around a dining room table or wherever you're at, and I think even if you're alone this Thanksgiving, although you don't have to be, we'll have Thanksgiving here on Thursday if you want to come. But I think there's room for us to practice another response to being alive that is not our easy default position of no. There's room for the practice not necessarily of some morbid focus on our mortality, but rather the opportunity to say out loud that these moments and these lives simply will not last forever. You may learn a lot about yourself and your friends and your family through the practice of naming the preciousness of things that will not last. All morning, I did the work I love. It might have been otherwise. And we have arrived in this sanctuary together safely with old friends and new welcomed guests. It might have been otherwise. The sun is shining on us today in all our successes and failures alike. It might have been otherwise. And tomorrow we will begin planning another week, much like this one. But one day I know it will be otherwise. Take good care of yourselves this week, friends. Blessings on all your days. Amen.